Through My Eyes by Ruby Bridges, read by Tiffany Hardy.
Born in the Deep South. I came into this world as a healthy 7-pound baby, my parents' first child on September 8, 1954. From the small hospital in Tylertown, Mississippi, where I was born, my mother took me home to farm where my parents lived with my father's family.
My father's parents were sharecroppers who worked the land under the broiling Mississippi sun. Sharecroppers didn't own the land they farmed. They paid rent to the landowner and whatever crops they raised and struggled to survive on what was left. My mother's parents were sharecroppers too.
When I was older, I loved visiting the farm where they lived. After my family moved to New Orleans, I went back and spent every summer of my childhood on that vegetable and dairy farm. I wasn't the only child on the farm. My mother came from a big family, and many cousins went to help out in the summer. My parents stayed in New Orleans to work. My grandfather tended the dairy herd while my grandmother Amy took charge of the 2 acres of vegetables. You can grow a lot of vegetables on 2 acres. All summer long, my grandmother organized my cousins and me into work shifts, heading into the field to pick beans or cucumbers or helping in the kitchen with the cooking and canning. Canning meant preserving food so that every family would have vegetables through the winter. That was how the grown-ups fed the children. Those hot summers were good ones. When I fell into bed at night, I was tired, yet happier than at any other time of my life. I took the summers for granted then, the way kids do. But I now know they were a gift. Best of all was being with my grandmother and being one of her favorites. Her love and attention made me feel very special then, and even more so now. A new home. My family moved to the old seaport city of New Orleans in 1958 when I was 4. On the block where I lived, everyone was black. White families lived on the next block, but at the time it seemed as if they were a world apart. A lot of the black people, like my parents, had left farms in Louisiana or Mississippi to make a better living in the city. In New Orleans, we rented the front part of a large house on French Street. It was a big rooming house with other families living in apartments upstairs and in the back. Our part of the house had only 2 bedrooms, so my younger brothers and my sister and I shared a room. In 1960, when I started first grade, there were 4 Bridges children, but eventually there were 8 of us piling into bunk beds in that bedroom. The best part of the house was the kitchen, where we ate all our meals. My mother did a lot of cooking. We had a big southern breakfast with grits, bacon, and eggs, and homemade biscuits. At night, my mother sometimes cooked New Orleans style food like red beans and rice, or fried catfish or shrimp. For dessert, she sometimes made one of my favorites, banana pudding or sweet potato pie. The weather in New Orleans never gets too old, so we played outside most of the year. We stayed close to home and never left the block. Most afternoons, my mother wanted me to keep an eye on my brother and sisters, but I managed to play jacks and jump rope with my friends and climb the huge China ball tree by the house. On the weekends, somebody was always starting up a softball game in the lot next door. My world in those days were comfortable and safe. My parents didn't have much education, and it took everything they had to keep the family going. My father worked as a service station attendant. My mother sometimes took night jobs, like cleaning rooms in one of the city's hotels. I remember my mother taking a job making caskets. She would tell stories about how she and the other workers would get into the caskets to see if they were comfortable and how they would take naps in the caskets during their breaks. My brothers and sister and I thought those stories were fascinating. My mother brought us up to believe that God is always there to protect us. She taught us there is a power we can pray to anytime, any place. At the same time, my mother didn't allow any nonsense from her children. She was strict. We all had chores and were expected to carry them out. When she told us to do something, we were supposed to say, "Yes, ma'am," and not too much else about it. 1 year in an all black school. When it was time for me to start kindergarten, I went to Johnson Lockett Elementary School. My segregated school was fairly far from my house, but I had lots of company for the long walk. All the kids on my block went to Johnson Lockett. I loved school that year, and my teacher, Mrs. King, was warm and encouraging. She was black, as all the teachers in the black school were black then. Mrs. King was quite old, and she reminded me of my grandmother. What I didn't know in kindergarten was that a federal court in New Orleans was about to force two white public schools to admit black students. The plan was to integrate only the first grade for that year. Then, every year after that, the incoming first grade would also be integrated. In the late spring of my year at Johnson Lockett, the city school board began testing black kindergartners. They wanted to find out which children should be sent to the white school. I took the test. I was only 5, and I'm sure I didn't have any idea why I was taking it. Still, I remember that day. I remember getting dressed up and riding uptown on the bus with my mother and sitting in an enormous room in the school board building along with about 100 other black kids, all waiting to be tested. Apparently, the test was difficult, and I've been told that it was set up so that kids would have a hard time passing. If all the black children had failed, the white school board might have had a way to keep the schools segregated for a while longer. That summer, my parents were contacted by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP is an old and well-respected civil rights organization. Its members work to get equal rights for black people. Several people from the NAACP came to the house in the summer. They told my parents that I was one of just a few black children to pass the school board test and that I had been chosen to attend one of the white schools, William Franks Public School. They said it was a better school and closer to my home than the one I had been attending. They said I had the right to go to the closest school in my district. They pressured my parents and made a lot of promises. They said my going to William Franks would help me, my brothers, my sisters, and other black children in the future. We would receive a better education, which gives us better opportunities as adults. My parents argued about what to do. My father, Adlon, didn't want any part of school integration. He was a gentleman and feared that angry segregationists might hurt his family. Having fought in the Korean War, he experienced segregation on the battlefield, where he risked his life for his country. He didn't think that things would ever change. He didn't think I would ever be treated as an equal. Lucille, my mother, was convinced that no harm would come to us. She thought that the opportunity for me to get the best education possible was worth the risk, and she finally convinced my father. My mother breaks the news. When September came that year, I didn't start first grade at William Franks. The lawmakers in the state capital, Baton Rouge, had found a way to slow down integration, so I was sent back to my old school. I didn't know I was ever supposed to go to school anywhere else, so being back at Johnson Lockett was fine with me. All through the summer and early fall, the state legislators fought the federal court. They passed 28 new anti-integration laws. They even tried to take over the public school system. The Louisiana governor, Jimmy H. Davis, supported the segregationists. He said he would go to jail before he would allow black children in white schools. He even threatened to close all the public schools rather than see them integrated. The federal court, led by Federal District Court Judge J. Skelly Wright, unyieldingly in his commitment to upholding the law of the land and in his dedication to equal opportunity for all Americans, would block the segregationists again and again. J. Skelly Wright struck down the state's new anti-integration laws as unconstitutional. School integration would proceed, praise the Lord. The judge couldn't enforce his order in time for the start of school in September, but he set a new deadline for Monday, November 14th. The anger all across New Orleans convinced Judge Wright that things might grow violent. He asked the U.S. government to rush federal marshals to New Orleans to protect the black first graders. There were 4 of us in all. There was a 5th girl originally, but her parents decided at the last minute not to transfer her. 3 of the remaining children, all girls, were to go to a school named MacDonough. I was the 4th child. I was going to integrate William Frantz Public School, and I was going alone. On Sunday, November 13th, my mother told me I would start a new school the next day. She hinted there could be something unusual about it, but she didn't explain. There might be a lot of people outside the school, she said, but you don't need to be afraid. I'll be with you. All I remember thinking that night was that I wouldn't be going to school with my friends anymore, and I wasn't happy about that.
November 14, 1960.
My mother took special care getting me ready for school. When somebody knocked on my door that morning, my mother expected to see people from the NAACP. Instead, she saw 4 serious-looking white men dressed in suits and wearing armbands. They were U.S. federal marshals. They had come to drive us to school and stay with us all day. I learned later they were carrying guns. I remember climbing into the back seat of the marshal's car with my mother, but I don't remember feeling frightened. William Frantz Public School was only 5 blocks away, so one of the marshals in the front seat told my mother right away what we should do when we got there. "Let us get out of the car first," the marshal said. "Then you'll get out, and the 4 of us will surround you and your daughter. We'll walk up to the door together. Just walk straight ahead and don't look back." When we were near the school, my mother said, "Ruby, I want you to behave yourself today and do what the marshals say." We drove down North Galvez Street to the point where it crosses Alvar. I remember looking out of the car as we pulled up to the French school. There were barricades and people shouting and policemen everywhere. I thought maybe it was Mardi Gras, the carnival that takes place in New Orleans every year. Mardi Gras was always noisy. As we walked through the crowd, I didn't see any faces. I guess that's because I wasn't very tall and I was surrounded by the marshals. People yelled and threw things. I could see the school building and it looked bigger and nicer than my old school. When we climbed the high steps to the front door, there were policemen in uniforms at the top. The policemen at the door and the crowd behind us made me think this was an important place. It must be college, I thought to myself. The first day at William Frank's. Once we were inside the building, the marshal walked us up a flight of stairs. The school office was at the top. My mother and I went in and were told to sit in the principal's office. The marshal sat outside. There were windows in the room where we waited. That meant everybody passing by could see us. I remember noticing everyone was white. All day long, white parents rushed into the office. They were upset. They were arguing and pointing at us. When they took their children to school that morning, the parents hadn't been sure whether William Franks would be integrated that day or not. After my mother and I arrived, they ran into the classrooms and dragged their children out of the school. From behind the windows in the office, all I saw was confusion. I told myself that this must be the way it is in a big school. The whole first day, my mother and I just sat and waited. We didn't talk to anybody. I remember watching a big round clock on the wall. When it was 3 and time to go home, I was glad. I had thought my new school would be hard, but the first day was easy. Going home. When we left school that first day, the crowd outside was even bigger and louder than it had been in the morning. There were reporters and film cameras and people everywhere. I guess the police couldn't keep them behind the barricades. It seemed to take us a long time to get to the marshal's car. Later on, I learned that there had been protesters in front of the 2 integrated schools the whole day. They wanted to be sure white parents would boycott the school and not let their children attend. Groups of high school boys joining the protesters paraded up and down the street and sang new verses to old hymns. Their favorite was Battle Hymn of the Republic, in which they changed the chorus to "Glory, glory, segregation, the South will rise again." Many of the boys carried signs and said awful things, but most of all, I remember seeing a black doll in a coffin, which frightened me more than anything else. After the first day, I was glad to get home. I wanted to change my clothes and go outside to find my friends. My mother wasn't too worried about me because the police had set up barricades at each end of the block. Only local residents were allowed on our street. That afternoon, I taught a friend the chant I had her learn. 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate. My friends and I didn't know what the words meant, but we would jump rope to it every day after school. My father heard about the trouble at school. That night, when he came home from work, he said I was his brave little Ruby. My first white teacher. On the second day, my mother and I drove to school with the marshals. The crowd outside the building was ready. Racists spat at us and shouting things like, "Go home, nigger," and "No niggers allowed here." One woman screamed at me, "I'm going to poison you. I'll find a way." She made the same threat every morning. I tried not to pay attention. We finally got into the building. My new teacher was there to meet us. Her name was Mrs. Herring. She was young and white. I had not spent time with a white person before, so I was uneasy at first. Mrs. Henry led us upstairs to the second floor. As we went up, we hardly saw anyone else in the building. The white students were not coming to class. The halls were so quiet. I could hear the noise the marshal shoes made on the shiny hardwood floors. Mrs. Henry took us into the classroom and said to have a seat. When I looked around, the room was empty. There were rows of desks, but no children. I thought we were too early, but Mrs. Henry said we were right on time. My mother sat down at the back of the room. I took a seat up front, and Mrs. Henry began to teach. I spent the following first day with Mrs. Henry in the classroom. I wasn't allowed to have lunch in the cafeteria or go outside for recess, so we just stayed in the room. The marshals sat outside. If I had to go to the bathroom, the marshals walked me down the hall. My mother sat in the classroom that day, but not the next. When the marshal came to the house on Wednesday morning, my mother said, "Ruby, I can't go to school with you today, but don't be afraid. The marshals will take care of you. Be good now and don't cry." I started to cry anyway, but before I knew it, I was off to school by myself. What a passerby wrote. The author John Steinbeck was driving through New Orleans with his dog, Charlie, when he heard about the racist crowds that gathered outside the French school each morning to protest its integration. He decided to see what was happening. He especially wanted to see a group of white women who came to scream at me and at the few white children who crossed the picket lines and went to school. At the time, I didn't know that there were other children in the building. We were kept apart. The women were known as the cheerleaders. And their foul language even shocked a man as worldly as Steinbeck. I never met young Steinbeck, but he seemed to sympathize with what I was going through. He wrote about me in a book called Travels with Charlie. Steinbeck left his dog and his truck in a parking lot. He didn't want to take them to France, where his dog could get hurt or his car could get damaged. Instead, he took a cab. Fearing that protesters would wreck his car, the driver didn't take Steinbeck all the way to the school, but left him a few blocks away. Steinbeck never knew my name. My name and the names of the girls at McDonald School were never mentioned on television or in the newspaper. The press tried to protect us. Show some courage. At the start of school integration, many white parents were afraid of the protesters in front of the French school. Even if the parents believed in integration, they didn't want to put their children in danger by sending them to class. However, a few families took the risk. As a Methodist minister, Reverend Lloyd Foreman was convinced that integration was morally and spiritually right and was determined to keep his daughter Pam in the French school. That November, the minister walked Pam to and from school every day. Very quickly, the chorus of racists became obsessed with the Foremans. They taunted them without mercy. Another first grader. The Gabriels were another brave family. Daisy and her husband Jim had several children, including a 6-year-old named Yolanda. Mrs. Gabriel had been in the Army during World War II, and she refused to be bullied by the protesters. When I entered William Frantz, Daisy Gabriel did not take Yolanda out of school. I don't remember ever seeing Yolanda, even though she was a first grader. The school building was large, and any white children who attended were kept far away from my classroom. They were assigned separate teachers and were hurried in and out of school through a back entrance. Yolanda Gabriel came to school every day for 3 weeks. During that time, her family's home was attacked. Stones and rotten eggs were thrown. Windows were broken. Hecklers gathered in front of the house and threatened to hurt Gabriel's children. Daisy's husband was about to lose his job. Though the police set up protection for the family and a wonderful New Orleans woman named Betsy Winston offered to drive London to school each day, Daisy Gabriel knew her daughter was still at risk. In the end, the Gabriels gave up. They not only took Yolanda out of school, but also moved the family to another state, a northern state where Daisy's husband had grown up. It was time to get away from Louisiana. Three little girls at McDonald. While I was attending William France, a couple of miles away, three black girls were integrating McDonald, number 19. Their names were Liana, Tessie, and Gail. Riots in New Orleans. In those first 10 days of integration, people didn't protest just in front of the schools. Trouble broke out across the city. As I sat quietly huddled with Mrs. Henry, mobs of protesters roamed the streets. People threw rocks and bricks at passing cars. Some even tossed flaming bottles of gasoline. Hospital emergency rooms began to fill up. White people drove through the city at night, leaving burning crosses as warnings in black neighborhoods. African Americans knew this was meant to frighten them into giving up integration. The segregationist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan had been burning crosses in front of the black homes for many years all over the South. White parents from New Orleans even traveled to Baton Rouge to protest school integration in front of the state legislature. They wanted J. Skelly Wright, the federal judge who ordered integration, to be removed from office. A week of trouble. In the first week of school integration, the tension in New Orleans seemed to build each day. Rioters on the street were looking for trouble. Whites assaulted blacks in broad daylight, and blacks fought back, even though the NAACP urged them not to. Vandals broke store windows and took what they could. To curb the crowd that gathered, extra police on horseback and motorcycles were brought in. When Mayor DeLepsy, as Morrison appeared on television and called for calm, militant segregationists were enraged. They felt the mayor had betrayed them. Finally, the protesters began to die down. By the end of the week, the worst of the street riots were over. Thanksgiving was coming, and the public schools were closing for a week-long holiday. City School Superintendent James F. Redmond made it clear that school integration would continue after Thanksgiving. However, resentful white parents promised not to give up. They would protest again as soon as the schools reopened. New Orleans School Board appealed to the federal court for a temporary halt to integration. The board said it needed time to settle certain legal questions. Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP lawyer who commented on the appeal, would eventually become a justice of the United States Supreme Court. We are not alone. Everybody was glad for time out at Thanksgiving, including me. Even so, the stress didn't go away completely. The owners of the small grocery store at the end of the block suddenly told my family to stay away because we were part of school integration. The white owners no longer wanted our business. My grandparents telephoned from Mississippi to say they were afraid for us. They thought my father would be lynched, murdered by a lawless mob. My parents didn't tell us if they were afraid for their lives, but I knew my father was worried about how to make a living. The garage where he worked had fired him because I was going to a white school. Financial help was on its way, fortunately, and it came through the U.S. mail. People from around the country sent gifts and money. They knew what was happening in New Orleans because of television news programs as well as magazines and newspaper articles. many Americans wanted to encourage us. The money made a big difference to my family, and it kept coming for months. Along with the money came presents for me. There were toys, books, and clothes for school. The packages were addressed to me, so I thought they should be mine. My mother didn't agree. She would say, Ruby, you have to share these things with your brothers and sisters. They can't all be for you. When one child in a family is receiving a lot of attention, it can cause problems. The gifts were wonderful, but they sometimes meant a tug of war. I thought my mother was being mean when she told me that I had to give some of my presents away. We received stacks of encouraging cards and letters. Even Eleanor Roosevelt wrote me a note. She was the widow of Franklin Roosevelt, the former president of the United States. Mrs. Roosevelt's note was my mother's favorite, and she looked at it again and again. Eventually, letters came from around the world. We kept a lot of them, but they didn't survive. In 1965, a huge hurricane named Betsy flooded parts of New Orleans. Mrs. Roosevelt's letter was lost in the flood, along with the Purple Heart my father received for bravery in the Korean War. Those were sad losses. More support as I go back to school. I will always remember how our neighbors on France Street helped us through the winter. They came by all the time to see how we were doing. They were nervous about the racial tensions in the city, but they also wanted to support us. At night, they watched the house to make sure no one was prowling around. After the Thanksgiving break, neighbors would babysit or help me get dressed for school in the morning. They would also watch for the marshal car to arrive. Once I was in it, men from the neighborhood would walk behind the car, looking for signs of trouble as the car slowly left the safety of the block. One of our neighbors, who ran his own house painting business, offered my father a job. My father didn't hesitate. He was grateful. On the spot, he began a new line of work. In December, the crowd that gathered in front of the school was smaller than before. The people who came were angry, loud, militants, but the numbers were down. On December 5th, attendance at William Frantz was at 18, though at the time I did not yet know that other children were in the school. The legislators in Baton Rouge were still fighting school integration in the federal courts. There was a rumor they wanted to take the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but it never happened. John F. Kennedy, a liberal Democrat, had just been elected president, and segregationists in Baton Rouge knew that Washington would be less sympathetic to their cause than before. Through the winter with Mrs. Henry. After Christmas, my teacher and I settled into a routine. It was odd to be the only child in class, but I finally decided this was the way it was going to be here at the Frantz School. Being Mrs. Henry's only student wasn't a chore. It was fun and felt sort of special. She was more like my best friend than just an ordinary teacher. She was a loving person, and I knew she cared about me. Mrs. Henry and I always had fun. We did everything together, reading and word puzzles, spelling and math. We sang songs and played games. Since I couldn't go outside, we pushed desks out of the way and did jumping jack exercises. Once or twice, Miss Henry got permission for us to walk in the schoolyard, but it was strange to be out there with no other kids around. I remember seeing men standing off in the corners of the yard. I thought they were hiding from somebody. Later, I learned they were plainclothes detectives. I spent so much time with Mrs. Henry and liked her so much that I began to speak the way she spoke. I learned later that Mrs. Henry was a northerner from Boston, and she did not have a southern drawl. I didn't sound like my brothers and sisters, but I didn't know why. I now know that Mrs. Henry influenced me a great deal that year. She had a polite, kind manner that I admired. In fact, I began to imitate her. Little by little, I grew to love Mrs. Henry. We became very attached to each other. I draw pictures for Dr. Coles. A child psychiatrist, Robert Coles, came into my life that winter. At the time, he was a young man in the Air Force, stationed right outside of New Orleans. On his way to a medical conference one morning, he came upon the mob outside my school and noticed me being led into the building by the marshals. At that point, he became interested in me and wondered how I could go through such an ordeal. Soon afterward, he went to the NAACP to offer his help. Dr. Coles felt that it would be easier for me to endure the stress if I had someone to talk to outside of my family. Dr. Coles met regularly with me. He also met with the three girls from McDowell number 19 and with the white children from each integrated school. Every week, Dr. Coles would come to my house with his tape recorder. He would ask how I was doing, and I mostly told him I was doing fine. Then he would pull out crayons and would ask me to draw pictures of myself, or the school, or some of the people in my life. Afterward, he would talk about how the pictures showed what I was feeling, even if I couldn't put it into words. I think those pictures helped him to understand me. I enjoyed the time I spent with Dr. Coles because an important man was coming to visit me and color with me, and that made me feel special. His wife was a caring person and often came to the house with him. She would always bring something special for me when she came. My mother taught Mrs. Coles how to cook gumbo, and they became good friends. Dr. Coles later wrote about me in a number of books and articles, along with stories of other children of crisis. He seemed to admire how well I held up through the French school experience, but he was always curious about what kept me going. I have trouble eating and sleeping. There were times that winter when I did show stress. Nightmares would come and I could get up and go wake my mother for comfort. My mother would raise herself up in bed. Did you say your prayers before you went to sleep? She would ask. If I hadn't, Mama would say, honey, that's why you're having a bad dream. Go back now and say your prayers. I would do as she said and then I would sleep. Somehow it always worked. Kneeling at the side of my bed and talking to the Lord made everything okay. My mother and our pastor always said, you have to pray for your enemies and people who do you wrong, and that's what I did. Another problem that year was lunchtime at school. I often ate in the classroom by myself while Mrs. Henry took her lunch break with the other teachers. It was a lonely time. The marshal sat outside while I opened my lunchbox. As time went on, I couldn't eat. First, I blamed it on the fact that my mother fixed too many peanut butter sandwiches. Then I began to wish that I could go to the cafeteria with the other children. I could smell the food they were eating. I was convinced the kids were there. I began hiding my uneaten sandwiches in a storage cabinet in the classroom. I poured my carton of milk into the big jar of paste we had in the classroom. In my magical way of thinking, not eating lunch would somehow get me to the cafeteria. When roaches and mice began to appear in the room, a janitor discovered my old sandwiches. Miss Henry wasn't mad at me. She was just sorry there were so many days when I hadn't eaten. After that, she usually ate with me, so I wouldn't be lonely. At home, there was a period of time when I had trouble eating too. All I wanted were potato chips and sodas. My parents told Dr. Coles about it, and he tried to talk to me. He remembered the woman in the crowd outside the school each morning who said she was going to poison me. Dr. Coles thought I was afraid the woman would do it. I'm not sure if I was afraid of that or not. Perhaps I was just a picky eater. But in any case, once the year was over, my appetite returned. There were certain threats that winter and spring that helped me feel better. One NAACP member, a woman named Mrs. Smith, was particularly good to me. She was the wife of the pediatrician I saw that year. I believe that Dr. Smith was donating his services to make sure I stayed healthy. Mrs. Smith spent time with me to keep my spirits up. On the weekends, Mrs. Smith would pick me up in her car and I would go from one world into another. I went to a zoo for the very first time and visited Storyland at City Park here in New Orleans. Mrs. Smith also took me to her home. Compared to my family, the Smiths were wealthy, and I was amazed when I saw their color television and the piano that her son gave me lessons on. The whole family was very kind to me. Those were wonderful weekends, but they left me a little dizzy and unsure about who I was and where I belonged. But now it's clear to me that those visits showed me a better side of life and made me feel that I had to do better for myself. The end of first grade. Near the end of the year, Mrs. Henry and I finally had company. A few white children began coming back to school, and I got an opportunity to visit with them once or twice. Even though these children were white, I still knew nothing about racism or integration. I had picked up bits and pieces over the months from being around adults and hearing them talk, but nothing was clear to me. The light dawned one day when a little white boy refused to play with me. "I can't play with you," the boy said. "My mama said not to because you're a nigger." At that moment, it all made sense to me. I finally realized that everything had happened because I was black. I remember feeling a little stunned. It was all about the color of my skin. I wasn't angry at the boy because I understood. His mother had told him not to play with me, and he was only obeying her. I would have done the same thing. If my mama said not to do something, I didn't do it. The next thing I knew, it was June. That incredible year was over. Oddly enough, it ended quietly. I don't remember any special goodbyes as I headed off for summer vacation. I was sorry to leave Mrs. Henry, but I somehow thought she would be my teacher again in the fall and forever. Mrs. Henry gave me excellent grades at the end of the year, but I was told that the school principal threatened to change them. She said I had received so much individual attention that the grades weren't accurate. Miss Henry was angry and quarreled with the principal. Miss Henry was sad for me and very upset that the principal could be so mean to me. I don't know to this day whether the grades were changed or not, but it didn't matter. The principal couldn't change what was in my head. Mrs. Henry is gone. When I began second grade, no marshal drove me to school. In fact, they had disappeared sometime the previous spring. In the last months of first grade, a taxi driver was sent to pick me up every morning. In second grade, I was on my own. When I went back to school in September, I expected things to be the same. On the first day, I noticed there was no protesters outside, but I went up the front steps of the building as usual and headed for my old classroom on the second floor. Then someone steered me to a different room. When I walked in, I saw at least 20 other kids. There were even a few black kids. I couldn't believe it. I was upset to learn that Mrs. Henry would no longer be my teacher. Another white teacher was in charge. I wanted to run down the hall and ask everyone I saw, "Where is Mrs. Henry?" I felt very alone again. There was no one to talk to, no one to explain things. My heart was broken. Years later, I learned that Mrs. Henry had moved back to Boston during the summer. She was expecting her first child in the fall, and she and her husband wanted to raise their family in Boston. For me, losing my teacher and best friend and making the change to a normal school year was very hard. No one spoke about the previous year. It was as though it had never happened. At home, there were no NAACP people coming to visit, no packages in the mail. I did see Dr. Cole sometimes, but it wasn't the same. My second grade teacher seemed mean to me, and she didn't seem to like me very much. She even made fun of my Boston accent when I read aloud in class. "I know you had that northern woman for a teacher last year," she would tell me, "but you're not saying the words right." For months, I tried to pronounce words the way the other kids did, but I never again sounded like everyone else in the class. From second grade on, I felt different from the other kids in my class. And it wasn't just because of my accent. William Frank School was integrated, but the long, strange journey had changed me forever. Let me bring you up to date. Maybe you'll like to know what has happened to me since I helped integrate the France School. I finished William France and went on to graduate from an integrated high school. I have lived in New Orleans ever since. When I was in seventh grade, my parents separated. I think the pressure my family was under in 1960 caused serious problems in the marriage. My parents had never really agreed about my going to William France, and it put a wedge between them. Money problems and other family problems continued too, which couldn't have helped. After my parents separated, my mother moved us children out of our house on France Street and into a housing project. Over the next few years, my mother had a rough time financially. My father stayed in the old house, and I missed him so. He died of a heart attack when I was 24. I wasn't a child anymore, but losing my father was terrible. How did I get through 1960 and the long year of integration? I think it was a combination of things. For one, I really believed as a child that praying could get me through anything. I still believe that. Also, because of my mother's strict discipline, which was the way many children were raised in, I knew I was expected to obey. Getting through first grade was partly just a matter of obeying my parents. As the oldest child, I was also used to being responsible and looking out for my brothers and sister. The responsibility that was placed on my shoulders in first grade may have felt familiar to me, even if it was heavy. Still, I sometimes feel I lost something that year. I feel as if I lost my childhood. It seems that I've always had to deal with some adult issues. After graduating from high school, I remember wanting to go to college. I regret not having that experience. My mother thought doors would automatically open for me as a result of what I had accomplished in 1960, but there was no one around to help lead me through the doors as I was led through the doors of William France. After high school, I had the opportunity to study travel and tourism, and I later became a travel agent. One of the first African Americans to work for American Express in New Orleans. For 15 years, I thoroughly enjoyed working as a travel agent. It allowed me the opportunity to see parts of the world I had only dreamed about. Eventually, I met and married a wonderful man named Malcolm Hall, and we now have 4 sons. We've struggled financially, but the Lord has made a way for me and my family. We have also been able to send our sons to integrated schools in a city that is less racist than it used to be. In my adult years, I began to feel that my life should have a greater purpose. In the early 1990s, my youngest brother, Milton, was killed in a drug-related shooting in the housing projects where he still lived. I was very shaken by this, as was the rest of my family. However, my brother's death woke me up in a way. It made me take a long look at my life. I slowly began to realize that what I had done in 1960 was meaningful and important. It allowed me an opportunity to speak to people and to help kids who were in trouble, the way Milton had been in trouble. Little by little, my life took on a new meaning. It's odd how misfortune can bring on new blessings. One of the changes I made after my brother's death was to go back to the French school to do volunteer work as a parent liaison. My brother's younger children were students there, and I wanted to help them recover from their father's death. The school is in a poor neighborhood in the inner city, and most of the students there are now African Americans, as is true of most inner city schools. There's never enough funding to keep William France up to current standards or even to offer the students the same opportunities they would receive in some of the suburban schools I've been fortunate to visit. The kids are being segregated all over again. There aren't enough good resources available to them, and why is that? I needed to find a way to give the William France kids an equal opportunity to fulfill their hopes and dreams and enjoy school the way I did. I needed to find a way to help strengthen the school. That's what led me to establish the Ruby Bridges Foundation to do just that. Once the foundation was funded by the proceeds from the picture book, The Story of Ruby Bridges by Robert Coles, we started after school classes. Just a few small classes, but it was a start. We hired teachers for multicultural art programs. We started a ballet class, an African dance class, and a class on manners and etiquette. My hope is to bring programs like these to other inner city schools. I believe we must turn inner city public schools into great schools. The French schools should become a great school again. All of our schools should be good enough to attract a healthy racial mix, which I believe leads to the most effective learning for everybody. If kids of different races are to grow up to live and work together in harmony, then they are going to have to begin at the beginning in school together. Nowadays, I travel a lot, all across the country. I always feel nervous about public appearances, but I do book signings and school visits. In schools, I emphasize the importance of reading. I believe strongly in literacy and the power of education. Sometimes I also talk to kids about race. When I'm addressing young students, I read the story of Ruby Bridges. Older students who I talk to have often seen Ruby Bridges' story, the Disney television movie that was based upon my experience. With older kids, I start a discussion about the movie or the book and then get kids talking about racial problems in their own lives. When the scary subject of race is finally broached, kids want to talk and talk. It's very satisfying. When the story of Ruby Bridges was published in 1995, I became visible again to the public and amazing things began to happen. After the book came out, one of the people who discovered it was Barbara Henry. For many years, my first grade teacher and I were lost to each other. When she saw the book, she was able to contact me through the publisher. Being reunited with Mrs. Henry, as I am still tempted to call her at times, was one of the greatest joys of my life. We first saw each other again on a special episode of The Oprah Winfrey Show in 1996. We hadn't seen each other for 35 years. Now, we not only stay in touch, but we sometimes do book signings together as well. I have been in contact with Robert Coles again too. He had been out of touch with me for 30 years. During that time, he published a good deal and often wrote about me, but I wasn't very aware of it. It was as though Dr. Coles was keeping my story alive until I could grow up enough to tell it myself. To be honest, I feel as if my life grew away from me for a long time. It wasn't until I was 18 that I even found out that the artist Norman Rockwell had made me a subject in a painting. As a grown woman, I watched a public television series, Eyes on the Prize, about the civil rights movement, and my mother had to point out that some of the old film footage was of me. It's taken me a long time to own the early part of my life. I don't know where the events will go from here, but I feel carried along by something bigger than I am. For a long time, I was tempted to feel bitter about the school integration experience, not understanding why I had to go through it and go through it alone. Now, I know it was meant to be that way. People are touched by the story of the Black child who was so alone. Interest in the story keeps growing, and I'm not the one making it happen. The picture book and the Disney movie project seem to fall out of the sky. I received 2 honorary college degrees in recent years. I've been featured in newspaper articles and made television appearances, and I've become a public speaker, a job I never would have dreamed of doing. And in all of this, I feel my part is just to trust in the Lord and step out of the way. For many years, I wasn't ready to be who I am today, but I've always tried not to lose my faith. Now, I feel I'm being led by just that, faith. And now I'm closer to being at peace with myself than I ever have been.
The end.